And what is it then that justifies virtue, or morally good frame of mind, in making such lofty claims for itself? It is its enabling the rational being to have a share in the giving of universal laws, and thus to become fit to be a member in a possible kingdom of purposes. His nature has already marked him out for this role as an end in himself and therefore as a lawgiver in the kingdom of purposes. For a being has no value except what the law confers on it. The law-giving that confers all value must therefore have dignity, that is, an unconditional and incomparable value. And the esteem that a rational being must have for this is best described as reverence. Autonomy is thus the basis for the dignity of human nature and of every rational nature. Immanuel Kant. It is one of the great discoveries of Kant that we, as rational beings, as free beings, have autonomy. That is, our reason is not merely an instrumental reason, serving us, well, as an instrument to reach certain goals, reach certain ends that, even if the way of getting them may be rational, by themselves are not rational, but rather us having these purposes just comes from our sensuality, from our animal drives. No, we as free beings can give ourselves a law. We are not just under the law of nature, we can give ourselves a law, the moral law. We can act not following our drives, but rather according to our insight into what is good. I already discussed that in my previous lectures on what is freedom and also on the imperatives. And I said that reason, so to say, speaks to us, instructs us on our moral duty through the categorical imperative. And here I want to talk about what exactly that categorical imperative says. In other words, what exactly does it mean to be moral? What is our moral duty? I already started discussing that in my previous lecture. And in that lecture I said that the categorical imperative, according to Kant, can be expressed in 3 different ways, in 3 different formulas. So Kant stresses that it's always the same categorical imperative, that always it comes down to the same duties, no matter which formula we use. And in that last lecture I discussed the first and the most prominent, the most well-known of those formulas, which says that we should always act according to a maxim through which we can want for it to become a universal law, which, expressed in slightly less convoluted ways, basically just means to not have double standards, right? I mean, even our common language, our common morality agrees that we cannot contradict ourselves morally. For all the moral relativism of our days, for all of people not agreeing on what is moral or saying there is no morality even, it seems to be pretty common and pretty universally agreed that if you have double standards, if you on the one hand say that something is okay, maybe when you yourself do it or when your group does it, and on the other hand in other cases say that it's not okay, maybe when it's done to you, that is not right. This first formula of the categorical imperative Kant connects with the category of unity, because really it is about us having unity with ourselves. I said that the categorical imperative is really just the logical principle of contradiction, saying that we ought not to contradict ourselves, saying that something cannot be A and non-A, applied to the practical, to our actions. So this first formula is entirely formal. It is not about what we do, it is about how we do it. It says that objectively our actions should have a form, and that is the form of lawfulness. That is a form that would allow for it to become universal without contradicting itself. If my action only works because it's particular, because I do it and nobody else does it, so stealing works because I steal, but I want to keep what I stole. I want others to respect my property and to not take my possessions away, then it is immoral. Now in this lecture I want to get to the second, slightly less well known but still known and still very important formulation of the categorical imperative. It is the one that Kant would describe as the subjective formulation, the one connected to the category of plurality. Because when we act, no matter what our action is, objectively, the action must have a certain form, which again is what the first formulation of the imperative deals with. But subjectively, that is from my own particular perspective, from the perspective of he who actually does this action, I'm not just acting in a certain manner, in a certain form, but rather I have a certain purpose of my action. Whenever I act for something. I want to achieve something. Let's take the example that I already used in other lectures many times of driving a nail into the wall. I don't do that for its own sake. I do that, I use a hammer maybe to drive a nail into the wall. So the hammer is just there for the nail. And in turn, I drive the nail into the wall to maybe put up a picture there. So the nail is just there for the picture, and I want to put a picture on my wall, maybe because I like looking at it and it will bring me some sort of pleasure to see it every day. So again, the picture is just there for my pleasure. So that means that whenever you act, there's always a for or an in order to. Everything you do is just a means to another end or to a purpose that your action has. But then in turn, this end, this purpose, often, once again, serves as a means to another, yet higher purpose, right? The hammer is just there for the nail is just there for the picture is just there for my pleasure, and so on. Well, it becomes very clear easily that there's an issue here, and that is that we need a highest purpose. Here, once again, you have a parallelism between practical and theoretical philosophy. I already pointed that out, for example, in the last lecture on the categorical imperative, that in Kant there are always these parallelisms. And in theoretical philosophy, when you say that an object that you deal with, that you have cognition of, is just an appearance, that's fine, but then reason seems to demand that it is an appearance of something. So if I say something is an appearance, there must, so to say, be something behind it which appears. So in the end, our reason demands a thing in itself. So something that is not the appearance of something else, but rather that exists by itself. And the same now happens here in the field of the practical. If an action or something I use in that action is just a means to achieve some end, to get to some purpose, then sure, that purpose again could be a means to another end and so on, but there must be an end or a purpose in itself. Otherwise, that whole chain would be sort of just flying in space without a fundament. Nothing would then matter, nothing would then have any value. If there's no final purpose, then where do all these means that are just means to an end, where would they lead to? I mean, especially in the English language, the very way we say it, means to an end. I mean, end seems to imply that this is actually the end. There's nothing else behind it. So, we need a final purpose, and the question is, what can be that final purpose of our actions? So, something that I don't use in my actions to get elsewhere, but something that, has value in itself. Because whenever I act, whenever I use something as a means to an end, or whenever I consider something an end, I ascribe a certain value to things, right? Value is something practical. If we look merely theoretically at the world, there is no such thing as value. Like, in the universe, things don't come with price tags. Value only comes into being because there are practical beings. There are beings that want something, and because they want it, it has value for them. Well, Kant says that when we are looking for that final purpose, that end of ends, it cannot be something sensual. Anything that just appears, anything that is under the laws of nature, so heteronomy, laws that it hasn't given to itself, anything that is dependent, anything that is that is not free, cannot be the final purpose. Because if it's not free, it cannot set a purpose itself. It can be a purpose for somebody else, right? I can say this hammer is useful for me. I'm gonna use it to drive a nail into the wall. But the hammer itself cannot decide what happens to him or what he wants to happen to him. So anything that appears, anything that is just in the sensual world, can be a means, but it cannot be final purpose. And that is why, morally speaking, these are just things or just items, Kant says. I'm actually gonna go with item here. I talked about it a little because I think usually the word Kant uses is translated as thing into English. But the issue is that in German there are two words that both have the meaning of thing. One is Ding, which is basically the same as the English thing. It's cognate, it has the same root. And the other is the word Sache. Both are usually treated as synonymous, but Kant uses them in very specific different ways. When he says Ding, it's basically just a German translation for object. This is a very general and very neutral term for Kant. It can also be a thing, an object of thinking. So anything, whether it's alive or dead, or whether it's a rational being even, can be a thing, or in German, Ding. So even the human being, or even God, is considered a thing by Kant. So it's just a general term for a something, so to say. While on the other hand, the word Sache, he uses not as a theoretical term, but just in his practical philosophy, in his ethics, and in his philosophy of justice. Sache is something that can be used, that can be bought. So God is a Ding, but not a Sache. So I talked about the translation, and usually both Ding and Sache are translated with the English word thing, which in general is a correct translation, but you kind of lose this differentiation that Kant makes. And that's why I decided that it is probably better to translate Sache when Kant uses it with item, which is, I think, the best you can do in English. Because what Kant means by Sache, or I'm going to say item from now on, is well, precisely something that can be used, something that is useful. And anything, again, in the sensual world, anything that can be used for other purposes is, morally speaking, an item. It doesn't matter even if it's alive, if it has feelings. So even animals are items, according to Kant. As a side note, this has often been criticized, especially if, once again, we translate Sache as thing. So Kant is understood as saying animals are things. But it is mostly just criticized because people misunderstand Kant. When they hear that he says animals are items or animals are things, what they think is that he's saying, oh, animals don't have feelings, or we can do with animals whatever we want, it's okay to abuse them. And that is why especially people who care about animals often criticize Kant and Kant's morals nowadays. But that is wrong. Kant is actually against animal abuse, and would say that animal abuse is immoral. I will explain further what he says about animals and why we shouldn't abuse them eventually in its own lecture. But I just wanted to point it out that you mustn't misunderstand when Kant calls animals items. It is, once again, not a theoretical term. So by item, he doesn't make a statement on whether that item is a living, feeling being or not. It can totally be sentient and still be an item. What he is saying is that the item is that, once again, which can be used and which has value insofar as it is useful. And the value of an item Kant calls a price, because, and that is how he defines price, it is a value that can have an equal value. There can be another thing of equal value, and they can be exchanged for one another. So when I have an item, it is just a means to reach a purpose, and any other item which could serve the same means would be equally fine for me. I don't really care, right? So again, let's say you want to drive a nail into the wall. You want a hammer to do that, but you don't particularly care which hammer you use. One hammer is as good as the other. The hammer does have value for you, but only insofar as you have this purpose. Like, if I didn't want to hammer, if I didn't want to drive any nails into the walls and somebody was trying to sell me a hammer, I would just say, no, sorry, I'm not gonna buy that, I'm not gonna give you money for that. It would be a waste of money for me, because for me that thing is worthless. That is why things are worthless to us. Why, I don't know, a stone on the roadside has no worth for anybody, because nobody wants to use it. If you want to use something, then and only then does it get a value for you. I mean, thing could also have value for you because somebody else wants to use it, and you know that you could sell it to that other person, even if you yourself don't care about that thing. But then you're still using that thing. You're just not using it. Like, for example, you are not using the hammer to hammer if you sell it. You're using it to sell it. You're using it to make money, but it is still a form of using that thing. Something gains value for us in the sense of a price when it is in some ways useful, when in some ways it can serve as a means to reach some goal we have. And again, the price is a value that can be exchanged. So I can buy that hammer for a certain amount of money, or I could also exchange the hammer for another hammer, because again, I don't care which hammer I use, and that goes for all items. Likewise, when you want to eat, when you eat your dinner, I'm assuming you own more than one fork. So maybe you open your drawer with your forks and you just grab one fork. You don't particularly care which of your forks you grab, because they're all equally good. You just want to use it to eat. And here we can see why even animals are items to Kant. I mean, let's put pets aside. Let's put sentimental value that a specific animal might have for us aside, and let's consider pets, or let's consider animals, not as pets, but as objects that are useful, as a means to an end. Like, if you want to eat meat, like if you want to, let's say, eat pork, you don't particularly care which pig it is you're eating, as long as it's pig. One is as good as the other. Or if you want wool for, I don't know, a pullover, you don't particularly care from which sheep it comes from. Or if you have a cart and you want horses to draw it, you don't really care which horse. One is as good as the other. They both have the same value, that is the same price. They could be exchanged for the other. All of this, of course, under the assumption that they really are as good as the other. Like, of course, you would want a horse that is strong and that can actually draw your cart, and you wouldn't want to exchange it for an old, weak, lame horse. And that goes, of course, for all items. Like, sure, one car is as good as the other. I would be willing to exchange one car for the other if they are the exact same type of car. Of course, if one is a better, more valuable, faster type of car, I wouldn't exchange it for a worse one. And even when it's two cars of the same type, of course I want them in the same condition also. If one is old and broken, then of course it has less value. But if you have two items that are equally good at serving as a means to the same end, at reaching the same goal, then they also have the same price. That is what a price means to Kant. It is a value that we give to something because it is useful, and it is a value that makes it so that this thing can be exchanged for another thing. And such items cannot be the final purpose of our action, because they themselves, they serve that action. The action can ultimately not be about that item. The value an item has can only be a relative value. It is only a value that is there because it is useful. If it stopped being useful, it would stop having a value. Like if suddenly all rational beings, all humans vanished from the world, then so would all the price. In that second, gold would no longer be any more valuable than any stone, because there would not be anyone ascribing any value to it. Now Kant says that, on the other hand, a being which is free, and that means a being which can give itself a purpose, which can decide what it wants, only such a being can be a purpose in itself. Precisely because it is the being which gives purpose to other things. Precisely because if that being was lost, everything else would also stop having any purpose. Again, if humans suddenly vanished, the hammer or the fork or the car would no longer have a purpose, would no longer have a value. That is precisely because, or that is precisely the reason why the human being as such, why the rational being as such, is a purpose in itself. It's not there just for something else, rather other things are there for it, for the rational being, and the rational being is there for itself, because it sets purposes. And to Kant, the sort of the moral law, of the autonomy, of us giving ourselves a purpose, is the highest, the most sublime sort there can be. And everything else is only there for us. The apple only has value if there's someone who wants to eat it. The house only has value if there's someone who wants to live in it. But we have value in ourselves precisely because we are the ones to ascribe value to things. And this type of value we have, Kant calls dignity. So there are two types of values. There are prices and there are dignities. The price, as I already said, is a sort of value that has an equivalent. So a thing that has a price can be exchanged for something of equal price, while the dignity means a sort of inner value that a thing has in itself, that cannot be exchanged for anything else. And this dignity, once again, comes from freedom, comes from autonomy. Which, if you think about it, I think anyone can agree. Like, even long before Kant, people at least had an unconscious sense that dignity is connected to freedom. And this is, of course, what philosophy has to do. I mentioned that, for example, in the lecture on what is metaphysics. Philosophy, according to Kant, should not come up with entirely new thoughts or claims, but rather bring clarity, bring consciousness to that which unconsciously is already in us. And that's the case here with dignity, right? I think in ancient times, for example, people would have said that the king has a very high dignity, but the slave does not. Why would they say that? probably because the slave is dependent. The slave must serve. The slave is not his own master. The slave is under laws that he himself has not given. But the king, on the other hand, is autonomous. The king is only under his own laws, so to say. He himself gives the laws. He's a lawgiver, and that is what gives him dignity. And since to Kant all rational beings have autonomy, are lawgivers, they all have dignity. And this is what makes you a person. So to Kant, considered from the moral perspective, there are two types of things in the universe. There are items, which have a price, and there are persons, which have a dignity. Anyone, any being, be it humans, be it some aliens maybe, or some angels, or even God, any being which is not merely sensual but is rational, which has the autonomy to define and determine purposes, and therefore is a purpose in itself, any such being is a person and has its own dignity, not just a price that could be exchanged for something else. And again, this is precisely why Kant calls animals items. Again, you mustn't criticize him as if he was saying that animals are not sentient beings, but he's saying animals are not persons. They have no dignity. And this is something that anyone should be able to agree with if you're not completely ideological about animal rights or whatever. I mean, even people who care about animals, even people who are vegetarian or vegan, would usually agree that an animal is not a person with its own dignity. If it was, we could not buy animals, we could not buy pets, or we could not put a dog on a leash. I mean, if you do that to a human being, that is clearly an attack on that being's dignity. That is clearly immoral. But if you do it with your animal companion, that is fine. Because again, the animal is an item. Only a person, only a being of autonomy has a dignity. This, as I said, goes for humans just as much as for God. However, God, being a pure rational being, having no sensuality, God is only a person. He cannot serve as an item. The human being can be both, right? You can reduce humans to mere items. You can enslave humans. You can put a price on humans. Because humans are not just rational beings. They don't have just autonomy. They also can be useful as means to an end, as tools. With God, that's not the case. God cannot be used. God is not a means to some other end. God is only a person and can never be an item. He only has dignity and no price. And that is precisely why we cannot be immoral against God, Kant would say. We have no means of hurting him. We cannot disregard him, so to say. So God is sort of outside of our moral duties because we have no ways of, reducing him to an item. And this is important. I want to use this for a moment to go on a little tangent and to digress a bit. Because I believe that here Kant's philosophy, especially if you combine it with the thoughts of Georges Bataille, can be an important key in understanding both religion and atheism. Because if you think about it, religion is about the holy or the sacred. And the sacred is that which has its own dignity, so an inner value, an absolute value, and not just a relative value, not just a price, right? If you consider something sacred to you, then you ascribe value to it not just because it is useful, not just because it can serve as a means to an end. In fact, using it as just a means to an end would be considered a sacrilege, just like it would be considered evil to use a human just as a means to an end, to enslave a human. Just like that, you would not, let's say, if you believe in the Bible or if you believe in the Quran and believe that it is a holy book, you would probably not use it as a door stopper. Or to put it under your table if your table is not if your table is shaking a bit or whatever. You would not do that. If you consider something holy, then you ascribe its own worth to it. Of course, a mere object like a book or I don't know, there are all sort of holy relics, right? Like a piece of clothing or bone of a holy person or whatever. Of course, a mere object cannot have worth. It cannot have value as such. It can only have a price and no dignity. So the only reason why such objects might be considered sacred and might be given a dignity is because of God, because in the end they are considered as if they contain God, because God is he who really is holy in the end, right? They are considered as if they contain God in them, right? So a book, the paper as such, is not holy. Like the same paper that is used for printing a Bible or Quran or whatever could also have been used for some profane book. But since it is considered to now contain God in a way, that is how it becomes sacred. So really the dignity of the sacred object in the end is God's dignity. It is an appearance of the holy. Now the thing is, however, that many believers do treat God as if he was a useful object, as if he was an item. Just like they would use a horse to pull their cart, and they would maybe give the horse a carrot or a cube of sugar or whatever. Just like that, they consider God someone who can do something for them, who can make it rain so their crops grow, or who can cure the illness of their loved ones, or who can secure them a job, or just a parking space, or who can help them pass an exam or whatever. But of course, instead of carrots or sugar, they give God other things. They give him prayers or sacrifices or whatever. But really the mechanism in the end comes down to the same. And this is what Kant would call paganism. I will get more into that when I come to his philosophy of religion, but to him paganism is not about whether I have one god or many, but it is about treating God as something useful and treating God as something that can be bought or whatever. Treating God as someone who needs something from me, and in exchange for me giving him my prayers or my sacrifices or whatever, might give me what I want. And this is, of course, a completely wrong concept of God. God is not useful. Rather, I would say that we could define God as the supreme uselessness. And this might sound very blasphemous. This might maybe anger certain believers if you tell them God is useless. But I would say, if you really think about it, the opposite is blasphemy of the highest order. To claim that God is useful, to claim that you can submit God to your goals, to whatever your purpose is, and God just serves like the horse in front of your cart or like the hammer in your hand to achieve your goal. No, God is the supreme usefulness. And now, if you listen to, I would say, most atheists nowadays, if you ask most of them, why are you an atheist? The answer usually comes down to precisely this. I'm an atheist because God is useless. It turned out I could not use God. I don't know. Back in school, I wanted to pass my exam, and I prayed, and I still failed my exam. Or my dad had cancer, and I prayed, and still he died. Or I prayed for world peace, and still there's no world peace. So it turns out that God is entirely useless. Now, this is indeed a way in which this atheist is one cognition, one insight ahead of the common pagan believer. This believer still thinks that God is useful, still treats God as an object that is just there to be an item, to be a means to my ends, while this atheist also considers God just an item, but realizes that God is not an item, that God is not useful, and therefore concludes that there is no God. And we don't have to follow the conclusion, but the premise of that conclusion is actually right. And in this premise, he is actually ahead of the believer. And as a side note, this is basically me applying Kant's sympathetic method, right? I made a lecture on that method. The method basically states that nobody is completely and utterly wrong. There's always some partial truth even in the error, and we should therefore not dismiss and throw away other opinions as totally wrong, but rather we should try to find the partial truth even in the error. And I would say the partial truth in this sort of atheism is precisely that yes, indeed, God is not useful. However, if your conclusion is that therefore God does not exist, that seems to imply a second premise, which is that nothing exists that is not useful. Atheists sometimes like to say, I only believe in what I can see, which seems to be a theoretical statement, but I think they would be much, much more honest if they turned it into a practical statement and said, I only believe in what I can use. And that statement is something which would make me distrust a person very much. And even before I gained a deeper understanding of Kant's moral philosophy, I always had a sort of instinctive distrust of these people, of these sorts of atheists and materialists. Because if you say that you don't believe in what you can't use, if you say that there is no God simply because he's not useful for you, well, humanity as such also cannot be seen. Our humanity, our inner humanity, not the specific human being, but our inner humanity, us as rational beings, that in us which has dignity, it can also not be used. If you only believe in usefulness, then you must reduce the human being to his sensual side, to that side which can be used, which can be objectified, which could be enslaved even. And therefore, this sort of materialism will lead not just to atheism, but also to rejecting morality alongside with religion. And I know that many atheists don't like to hear that many atheists get angry when you insinuate that they cannot be moral because they're atheist. And they are right if they say it's not moral if you are just moral because God commands it. That's not what I'm talking about here. That's the strength of Kant's moral philosophy. It does not depend on God. Quite the opposite, God depends on it. I will explain that when I get to his philosophy of religion, that to him religion is deduced from morality, not the other way around. But what I'm saying is that if you are fixated only on usefulness, and that which is invisible, the intelligible world, the world of the beings, the rational beings, does not exist to you, there is no thing to you which has dignity, then you cannot have morality as such. And I think it's no coincidence that this modern atheism originates in the 19th century and has become more and more prominent since the 19th century, which is the same century where this materialistic objectifying and commodifying of all the world and of all nature, including the human being, really started to become prominent, and which is the same century from which both capitalism and communism were born. Because as Bataille shows, they are not opposites, they are more like brothers. They equally commodify, they equally are obsessed with usefulness, they equally treat everything just as a means to an end and nothing as an end in itself. And when many atheists say, oh, I can still be moral even if I don't believe in the intelligible world, what they mean is a morality of sympathy, of compassion. And of course you can feel compassion with not just with persons but with items, not just with human beings, even with animals. With anything that feels, you can of course feel compassion if it has pain, but that is not a fundament for true morality. I will explain that further in a future lecture, why Kant rejects compassion as a basis for morality. And the only morality you are left with then is one that is built on usefulness. It's that inhumane utilitarianism, which is the moral principle that says we should do the greatest good, we should prevent the greatest harm, the greatest unhappiness, and which therefore says that it is perfectly fine to sacrifice human beings if, for example, you can save others with that. So, which says that the human being as such has no dignity, he has only a price, and there can be an equivalent, and there can be even something more valuable, like many humans are more valuable than one. And Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, so to say, who lived at sort of the start of the 19th century, like more in the 18th, but towards the end of the 18th century he came up with the utilitarian principle. Bentham actually criticized and ridiculed the French Revolution with its declaration of universal human rights. He said that's nonsense up in stilts. There is no such thing as human rights. There is only usefulness. And this is somewhat consistent if you are a materialist. But with that, let us go back to Kant and to the categorical imperative, because all of what I said so far leads us to the second formula of that categorical imperative. Everything sensual, everything in nature is just an object. It is there for us, but not for itself. And therefore it can be treated as an item. It can be given a price, a relative value. Everything that is rational, that is autonomous, so God is a pure rational being, is just a subject. It is there for itself, but not for others to be used by others. It is a person with its own dignity that cannot be reduced to an item. But the human being, as being both sensual and supersensual, both a thing of nature and a rational being, the human being is, to use a term of Fichte, the subject objectivity. And that is why it is the human being which can be treated in a moral but also in an immoral manner, and where we have a duty to act. And therefore the categorical imperative in the second formula, the material formula, that it's not just about the form of our actions but about the actual content of our actions, what should we actually do, says that we should act in such a manner that we treat humanity, both in our own person and in the person of everybody else, never just as a means, but always as a purpose in itself. That's what the categorical imperative in the second version says. As a side note, I think often it's translated as act in a manner that you treat humanity both in your person and in that of everybody else, not just as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. I chose to say purpose instead of end. Translating it with end is not in itself a wrong translation. If you just look at Kant's moral philosophy, but I think something is lost if you consider Kant's philosophy overall, because the word he uses here in German is Zweck, and Zweck means something like the end, but not end as in something ending, like the end of a book or whatever, but end as in where we want to get at, the goal. Zweck can mean goal, Zweck can mean purpose, Zweck can also mean sense or point. Like if I say something is zwecklos, that's basically as saying in English something is pointless, there's no sense in doing it. So Kant uses this word Zweck, and this word in his philosophy is a very important word. I already discussed that word and the difficulties of translating it in my lecture on what is philosophy to Kant. And there I said that to him our power of judgment has the concept of Zweckmäßigkeit. So if we translate Zweck with purpose, then it is purposiveness, which serves as a very important bridge between theoretical and practical philosophy. And in my lectures on Kant's aesthetics, what is beauty, what is the sublime to him, I explained that to him this is about the purposiveness of things. So we find something beautiful because its form is purposive. It seems to not be random, not be chaotic, but rather the form has a certain harmony. The form is, even if it's not a piece of art, but something beautiful in nature, the form is as if someone had made it that way on purpose. And it is important to him that the beautiful nature serves as a sort of symbol of the supersensual, the moral realm. So since this word Zweck, which I would translate as purpose, is sort of a red thread running through Kant's philosophy and connecting various parts of his philosophy, connecting his moral philosophy with his aesthetics, his philosophy of the beautiful, and also with his thoughts on natural science and particularly on biology, which I will get into at a later point in the next year. That is why I believe it is important for any translator of Kant to, whatever word he chooses to translate the word Zweck with, at least always translate it with one and the same word. Stick to one and the same word, because otherwise you lose the sense of this connection between various parts of Kant's system. And that's why I'm going with purpose here. So the categorical imperative once again says act in a manner that you treat humanity, both in your own person and that of everybody else, never just as a means to an end, but as a purpose in itself. This second formulation, as I already said, is connected by Kant to the category of plurality, because he says there is a plurality of ends, or plurality, once again, of purposes. We have all sorts of purposes. We want all sorts of things with our actions, and that is fine. We can, of course, have different purposes, but amongst this plurality of purposes, humanity should always be the highest purpose. Humanity should always be treated as a purpose in itself, while anything else has only relative value, has only a price. Humanity must be treated as having a dignity. So sure, I can have the purpose of getting some object that I would like, but not if in the process I harm humanity, because that object's already owned by somebody else and I'm stealing it from him. Sure, I can have the purpose of getting sexual gratification, but not if in the process I'm hurting humanity's dignity because I rape somebody. So, amongst the plurality of purposes, humanity must always be the highest purpose, the one purpose that is never sacrificed for any other purpose. That's what Kant is saying with the second formulation of the categorical imperative. And of course here, when he uses the word humanity, nowadays there's a slight ambivalence about that word. He of course doesn't mean humankind, so he doesn't mean the sum of all living humans, but rather by humanity he means that inner quality of being human. That in us which is human, like as if when you say somebody has lost his humanity, you are not saying he has lost all 8 billion humans, but his own being human. Kant would always say that we can consider ourselves from two sides, as appearances, as sensual beings, as individuals that appear in this sensual world, and as a thing in itself, as humanity, as the rational free being as such. I already went into this in the last lecture on the categorical imperative, and I also went into this in more detail in the lecture on the apperception or the self-consciousness. That to Kant there is the homo phenomenon, the appearing, the sensual human, me or you, this or that individual, and to him there is the homo noumenon, the supersensual, the rational, the human in himself, and that is what he means by humanity, that homo noumenon. So basically what he's saying here is that this humanity, this ideal of the human being not as he is, but as he can and should be, because the specific individual might be very irrational in the manner he acts, or he might be an asshole, he might be utter scum, but he still has humanity, he still has freedom, so he could be more. He could be the most amazing person, he could be the most holy person, he could be Jesus or Socrates. And that ideal humanity in everyone, that is what we should have regard or reverence for, Kant says. That is what morality is about. Not about the homo phenomenon, not about the human as he is, but about that inner humanity, that inner homo noumenon, and having reverence for that. It is important here to be mindful of the specific wording of the categorical imperative, because Kant is not saying that you mustn't use humans as means for some other purpose. He is saying that you mustn't reduce them to being only a means to some other purpose. You must also, but not exclusively, just also treat them as a purpose in itself. And that is important, because we constantly objectify humans. We constantly use humans as means for our ends. And we cannot help doing that. I mean, maybe if you went away from society completely and lived on your own on some lone island, then you could prevent doing that. But otherwise, you cannot prevent doing that, because we are also sensual beings. We are not pure rational beings, and we have sensual needs. And in the most daily and trivial occurrences, you do use humans as means for your purposes. When you go to the baker to buy bread, the baker is a means for your purpose, for you getting bread. You might as well go to a baking robot, as long as as that robot managed to bake good bread. And likewise, if you hire somebody to build a house, of course that construction worker is a means serving your purpose. Again, you could also get a robot to do it if there was a sufficiently advanced robot. If you have sex with someone, even if it's consensual sex, even if it's loving, you are still in a way objectifying that person and using that person for your own sexual gratification. And likewise, right now, you are using me as a means to learn about Kant. Again, these things could be done by an item too. You could, instead of having sex with someone, you could get a sex doll or a sex robot or whatever. Instead of learning from me about Kant, you could ask some AI, you could ask ChatGPT. Also, I strongly, very, very, very strongly advise you against that, because I tried just for fun to see how it works, and I wanted to bash the computer in. This is so bad. There are so many errors, so many lies about Kant. I mean, if you ask the most superficial questions like when was Kant born, okay, but anything even slightly specific, that thing has no clue about Kant, obviously. But that aside. The point is, you do constantly use humans as means for your purposes, and that is not evil as such, that is not immoral as such. It only becomes immoral if you just objectify someone, if you just reduce someone to a means which might have value as a means, which might have a price, but if you take away their dignity. So sure, you can hire someone to build your house, and as long as you let him decide if he wants to work for you, as long as you treat him right, as long as you give him a proper wage, that is fine. But if you enslave somebody to build your house, that is not fine. And likewise, sure, you can have sex with somebody, and in a way, you are using that person's body to get off. But if you only do that, like if you rape somebody, if you just reduce them to a body, not caring about their consent, that is evil. If you have consensual sex, if you have regard or respect for that person at the same time and don't just consider them a means to get off, then that is moral. So that is important here. It is not immoral per se to use somebody as a means for your purposes. You just mustn't reduce them to being only that. You just mustn't treat them as if they have no value, no agency, no freedom, no dignity of their own, but just existed for you. That would be evil. No, morality means that even while you treat somebody as a means for your purpose, you still have regard or reverence for them and still accept that they are a purpose in themselves and treat them as such. And what does that mean? Being a purpose in themselves? Well, let me remind you that it is all about the dignity of a rational being comes from the fact that we can set purposes, that we can decide this is my purpose, this isn't my purpose. In other words, that we have autonomy, that we are free. So morality means treating somebody as a purpose in himself means having reverence for his autonomy, letting him be free, not forcing ourselves on somebody, but rather accepting his freedom. And here it is very important, I want to stress that Kant's morality is not about whether you make somebody happy or whether you harm somebody, but it is really about this reverence for their autonomy. Because even if you force somebody to be happy, or whatever you think would make them happy, you are still forcing somebody. You are still disregarding that person's autonomy, and that is still wrong, Kant would say. I will get back to that when I get to Kant's political philosophy, where he says that a government should give people the freedom to, as the American Declaration of Independence says, to pursue their happiness. But a government should not itself try to give them happiness. Even if it's well-meaning, Kant says that leads to despotism. And I mean, we can see that in, for example, the communist systems that try to force people to their happiness. But also we can see that in fundamentalist systems, right? If they tell, for example, in Iran or in Afghanistan, if they tell women to veil themselves, they might be well-meaning. They might be saying to themselves, oh, we are saving them from hell. If they don't do that, they would suffer eternally. But the issue with that is that you are still disregarding their humanity, their autonomy. I mean, if you think that somebody is doing something which harms himself, you can talk to that person. You can try to convince that person to change his ways. If you think you have the one true faith and everyone who doesn't have it goes to hell, you can try to convince others of your faith, to save them, to get them into heaven. But what you cannot do is force others to be happy. I mean, even when it comes to small things, I'm reminded of one summer I was sitting in the garden with some friends, and my friend's roommate, he went inside and he asked me if it was very hot, if he should get me a glass of water while he got one for himself, and I said, sure, thanks, you can do that. And then he came back with water with ice cubes in it. And I hate that. I don't get why people like ice cold stuff when it's hot. I hate that stark contrast of temperature. It only makes things worse. Like, sure, for 1 second you get cooled, but then it feels even hotter. It would help much more to get something warm, in fact. Like if you wash yourself with a warm cloth when it's really hot, that is very cooling. That feels very good, but I would never drink some ice cold drink when it's all hot. The point is, and this guy couldn't understand that at all. The point is that he thought, of course, he was doing something good for me by adding ice to the water. But it is not his place to decide what is or isn't good for me. It is my own place. Maybe it's good for him. Maybe he likes it and he can put it in his drink. But he shouldn't disregard my autonomy and just put it in my drink. Having regard for my autonomy would have meant asking me, hey, I have a suggestion. I could also add ice. Would you like that? And then he could have left it to me, to my own free choice, whether I want that ice or not. But making decisions for others, even decisions that you think are good for them, that would be disregard of their humanity. And it's very important to me to stress that according to Kant, being immoral is not just about harming, about hurting others, but also when you seemingly treat others well, you can still reduce them to an object. You can still reduce them to a means. One other example I'm reminded of recently, like 2 months ago or so, I met some German guy, and he read on my website that I have a Jewish grandfather, and this is about the most uninteresting, irrelevant thing about me. Like, I have a Jewish grandfather. I also happen to have brown eyes. If I had blue eyes, nothing in my life would really change. If I had a non-Jewish grandfather, nothing in my life would really change. Like, that grandfather, I mean, he's one of 4 grandparents. I was never close to him. He was American. He visited Germany a few times, sure, but I met him maybe a dozen times. He himself was an atheist. I mean, sure, his Jewish identity was important to him. He was one of those left-wing New York Jewish intellectuals. was a professor of sociology, but he was not following the laws of Moses or anything. And I have no particular connection to Judaism. Like I wouldn't say I have any sort of Jewish identity. But this guy, he was one of those philo-Semites, of which we have an annoyingly high number in Germany, and he kept talking to me like for half an hour about my Jewish grandfather and asking me about that and being oh so fascinated by that. And there's a lot more you could read on my website. Like you could read about my actual philosophy. I have a lot of texts there, unfortunately only in German, but you could read about actual Aufklärung. And you could discuss that with me. But no, he only cared about this Jewish grandfather of mine. And then even like 2 weeks later, I met this guy again, together with some other people, whom I hadn't met before. And he introduced me to them and said, oh, Mr. Löwer, he is from a very old German Jewish family. I had told him before that my grandfather, my American grandfather, was Jewish. One Jewish grandparent from America. And as for his family, he was born in America, his father was born in America. His grandfather came from the Tsarist Empire, from around what would today be Ukraine. Further down the line, I don't know, but probably my Jewish ancestors lived for hundreds of years in Ukraine or Poland, Lithuania. And I had told him that, and then 2 weeks later, that had turned into, oh, he's from a very old German Jewish family. And I felt quite uneasy, quite disgusted in that moment, and also when I talked about it later on at home, I felt objectified. This guy didn't care about me as a person. He didn't care about my thoughts. He didn't care about my philosophy. He didn't care about what I had to say. He just cared about me being a Jew. And him being a German, having to show off that he is such a philo-Semite, that he is so pro-Jewish. And therefore, of course, he has learned from history. He is not a Nazi. By the way, that same guy, we were at a lecture about the RAF, which was in the 70s left-wing extremist terrorist group in Germany, and they had connections to the Palestinian PLO. They trained together with them. And after that lecture, that same guy asked the question, the RAF was so cruel. We in the West, we are not used to that cruelty. He's saying that in Germany, right? And where did their cruelty come from? Might it be because they trained with the Palestinians? So this guy had to show off having learned from history, being so pro-Jewish. And clearly, like always, when something is just a means to an end, when something is not a person with its own dignity, but just an item with a price, it could be replaced with any other item. I mean, he could have met, instead of meeting me, because he was not interested in what I had to say, he could have met any other person with Jewish ancestry and could have been equally smitten with that person. Because it is not about that person, it is just about the Jew. And if you reduce someone to just being the Jew, it's really not much better if you are a philo-Semite instead of an anti-Semite. It's really not much better if you are pro-Jews instead of being anti-Jews. You are still treating Jews not as persons that have their own dignity. And that is the important point for Kant. You must have reverence for someone's own autonomy, for who they are, who they want to be, what they want to do. And you should, that is what morality is about, you should treat everyone only in a manner that they themselves could want. You can only do actions towards others that could have come from their own will. Important here is the could. That is something I need to add, because while usually we should actually ask people what they want and not just assume, there are some instances where we cannot do that and we have to assume. Like consider surgery. Usually, of course, you should not just perform surgery on someone against their will, right? Even if it's for their own good, if you think so. Like a plastic surgeon cannot just kidnap someone and correct their nose and say, oh, it's for your own good, you had such an ugly nose and I made it better looking for you. No. The surgeon has to wait till that person comes to him and wants his nose corrected. I mean, you shouldn't get your nose corrected anyways. That too would be a matter of disregarding yourself. I will get more into that in another lecture when I get to the duties we have against ourselves. But that aside, the surgeon cannot force surgery on someone. But, of course, there might be some instances where, let's say, someone has an accident, someone is in a car crash, and someone is unconscious, and someone is about to die and needs immediate surgery. You can now, of course, not ask that person if he wants to be cut open, or if he wants to, I don't know, get his leg cut off, if that is necessary to save him or whatever. But you can assume that he wants to live. So if that is necessary for him living, then you can do it. So the point is for Kant that you must only perform actions on others that could have come out of their own will. Could have, not actually comes out of their own will. If they are unconscious and can't inform you about their will, then there might be some instances where you are allowed to think for them, but you must only do what could have come from their own will. Of course, this whole moral principle hinges on our autonomy. It hinges on the human being actually being free, because only because he can set himself a purpose is he the purpose in himself. Only because of that does he have dignity. So if you deny autonomy, if you deny free will, then this moral principle of Kant's doesn't work. Which is again why, as I already said earlier when I was talking about religion and atheism, if you are a materialist, and of course that is what most people are, that is our zeitgeist, then it is only consistent to say there is no such thing as dignity, there is no such thing as humanity. Humans too are just items, and therefore we cannot have regard or reverence for humanity. And then all you are left with is, again, that anti-human utilitarianism that tells you it's okay to sacrifice some people for the benefit of others. And all you are left with is some sort of compassion ethics that tells you to have compassion with others. But it should be clear that compassion has its limits. You cannot have compassion with 8 billion people. Nor should you, because you would just be crying all day if you really felt the pain of every single person who's suffering on the earth. No, this compassion usually is very limited. It usually doesn't even reach to the borders of our respective state, let alone beyond that. Like, some people might be very compassionate if they see someone suffering in front of them, but still they will buy mindlessly from Amazon, not caring about how the worker is treated there, about how the worker gets paid almost nothing, is not allowed to have a trade union, has to slave away all day just so Jeff Bezos can sit on his gigantic yacht and for his breakfast can get a special octopus dish. Or like, you can have compassion with specific people in front of you and still mindlessly ruin the climate, still mindlessly fly around or drive around in your car and thereby contribute to millions and billions of people suffering, losing their home and so on. So if we reject free will, if we reject autonomy, there is no morality left. Only if you believe that humans are free and therefore have a dignity, therefore need that freedom to be respected, only then can you have a true morality, one that is based on reason, on thinking, on understanding that all humans are equal in that regard and have equal worth, have equal dignity. And that autonomy, again, hinges on transcendental idealism. I discussed that in the previous lecture on do we have free will. There I discussed how Kant proves free will, and the whole philosophy of Kant in regards to free will, the whole proof of free will only works if you are a transcendental idealist. If you say, this world that appears to me, this nature, really is just that. It is an appearance, and therefore the law that governs this world, the natural law, which also governs me as an appearance, as a homo phenomenon, is only in place for these appearing things. But as a thing in itself, as a homo noumenon, I can still be free. I can still have autonomy. So I also gave a lecture on transcendental idealism already, what exactly that is. But the whole point is, if you reject transcendental idealism, if you treat nature not as an appearance but as a thing in itself, then you must deny free will, you must deny autonomy, and then you must deny human dignity. You must deny that there is such a thing as humanity having its own inherent worth. Now, Kant himself says that when it comes to making moral judgments, judging what we ought or ought not to do, it is better to use the first, that is the objective, the formal formula of the categorical imperative that I discussed in more length in the previous lecture, rather than this one, this second, this subjective, this material formula. However, here I disagree with Kant. I think that actually, and I found that again and again, often it is better understood by people, and it leaves them less room for abusing their own reason to twist a moral principle. For example, I once had a discussion years ago with some professor, some teacher of philosophy, or at least supposedly he was that. Supposedly he was an expert on Kant, and he was saying that the categorical imperative, that we should, he went with the first formula, that we should always act according to that maxim, that we could want to be a universal law. It's wrong, it doesn't work the way Kant wants it to, because Kant, for example, wants it to lead to the conclusion that murder is wrong in all instances. But that guy said you could, however, justify, based on that principle, the murder of a tyrant, because it could be a universal law that everyone agrees with, that a tyrant should be murdered. And even the tyrant himself, if he wasn't a tyrant but somebody being oppressed by a tyrant, would agree that murdering a tyrant would be good. That is a very, very wrong and superficial reasoning. It just goes to show that these people, whether they deal with Kant or with Rousseau, who greatly influenced Kant in practical philosophy, and who has this political principle, right? Where Rousseau clearly distinguishes between the will of all and the general or the universal will. And he says that the general will is not the will of all. It's not just the sum of all the individual wills. But that is something that people struggle with, that people don't get. And so I could agree that yes, the will of all who are oppressed by a tyrant would be for that tyrant to be killed, but that doesn't prove that this could make a universal law. Kant indeed very much rejects this, not just because of the humanity of the specific tyrant, also because Kant would say it's better to live in a state, even in a bad state, with unjust laws than to, through a revolution, enter a state of lawlessness. That I will discuss further in its own lecture when I get to what Kant says about the right to revolution. But my point here is, if you only use the first formula of the categorical imperative, maybe you can somehow tell yourself that it justifies, for example, murder of a tyrant or whatever. But if you go with the second formula, and I find it quite interesting that this second formula is talked about so little, is applied so seldomly, that even supposed Kant experts, even supposed professors, usually stick only to the first one, which can more easily be misunderstood and abused. If you apply this second formula, you can clearly see that murdering the tyrant would mean reducing him to a means to achieve others' happiness. It would mean not having reverence for his humanity, for his autonomy, but just treating him as a means for another purpose, and therefore it's wrong. Likewise, for another example, one that is more well known, there is the trolley problem that I assume many will have heard of. It's one of the most well known moral problems, moral dilemmas, and it's usually treated as a very big dilemma where there's no right or wrong, and where all moral philosophies struggle with, which it is not. It is a very clear-cut case. The trolley problem, for those who don't know, says that there's a trolley that is about to run over 5 people that are tied to the rails, and there is no way of stopping it in time. There's no way of getting them off the rails in time. So all you can do is pull some lever so that the trolley is directed onto another track. But the problem here is that on that other track, there's a sixth person bound to the rails. So it comes down to the choice between saving the 5 people, but in the process murdering a sixth innocent person, or letting the 5 people die, but in the process not murdering that sixth person. And again, if you use the first formula of the categorical imperative, that your maxim should be able to qualify as a universal law, well, according to that formula, you still shouldn't pull the lever. But maybe through some convoluted abuse of reason, someone could try to tell himself that sacrificing one person to save the 5 could somehow constitute universal law. But when you apply the second formula, it is very clear that this is evil, because it means that you are using that other person as a mere means for a purpose, for saving the 5, but you are not having reverence for his own humanity, for his own autonomy. You are not treating him as a purpose in himself. And that's exactly what utilitarianism does, right? Utilitarianism would be the moral principle which says you should always calculate. You should always ask what is the most useful action, that is the action that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, or that prevents the greatest pain to the greatest number of people. And here it becomes clear, or seemingly becomes clear, that saving 5 is better than 5 dying and 1 surviving. Of course, this utilitarianism, apart from being frankly quite disgusting and being, well, showing utter disregard for humanity, it also makes no sense. It is ridiculous. It is simply a stupid moral principle, because sure, on the face of it, it seems to make sense. It seems to be obvious even, right? 5 surviving is better than 1 surviving. But what you are saying is that this one person is not a purpose in himself. Him surviving is not something in itself that has value, but only if it's the better option. That means, however, that those other 5 surviving, you just pick that because in this instance it's the better option. But those other 5 also are not purposes in themselves. They also don't have dignity according to utilitarianism. They also don't have their own inherent value. Which means that if another trolley came along, but this time on the other rail there was not 1 person but 10 people, you would sacrifice the same 5 people that you previously saved. And then, the next instance, you would sacrifice the 10 people for 20, and the 20 for 100, and the 100 for 1,000, and the 1,000 for 1,000,000. And there is never a purpose in itself. Meaning that this whole utilitarianism is just sort of floating in empty space without a basis, without a fundament to stand on. Why would you, in one instance, sacrifice something for something else if that something else, by your own admission, and you do admit it when you sacrifice that something else for a third thing, if that something else also has no value? Here we go back to what I said at the start. Our reason demands an end to that chain. Our reason demands that not everything can be a means for some other purpose, which in turn is also just a means for a yet higher purpose. There needs to be a highest, a final purpose. Otherwise, the whole chain, if you go down the line again, is without purpose and therefore without value. If humanity as such has no value, if even the greatest sum of people, if even all 8 billion people put together have no value as such and could be sacrificed if it was for some greater good, then why would you sacrifice anything for them? Then why care about any of this at all? I mean, if you think this utilitarianism to its logical conclusion, then indeed even the 8 billion living people have no value of their own and could be sacrificed for even more people. For example, for the people that don't live yet. And this is exactly what the ideology of long-termism proposes. Which is the ideology that all these tech fascists like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel subscribe to. This long-termism, which is about, well, long-term thinking, thinking in thousands and millions of years instead of focusing on the now, this long-termism proposes that all the problems we have now here on this planet don't really matter. I mean, what is the justification for someone like Musk spending his obscene stolen wealth? Because it is stolen. You cannot be a billionaire. It is not just that some should have so much when others have so little. Spending this obscene wealth on stupid vanity projects like getting to Mars, colonizing Mars, instead of spending it to combat world hunger or to fight for world peace or most importantly to do something against the climate emergency. Well, the ultimately utilitarian logic behind that is saying, even if we solve world hunger and solve the climate emergency, even if we turn the earth into a paradise, then sure, 8 billion people will have a great life. But they are just 8 billion. If, however, we get humans to Mars, we start colonizing Mars, and then eventually later on we get out of the solar system and start colonizing other planets, we could eventually in a million years maybe be at a point where there are all over the galaxy planets inhabited by humans, and there wouldn't just be 8 billion humans, but I don't know, 8 trillion or 8 quadrillion humans. And that would be much better. That would be a much bigger, so to say, happiness potential, right? And so, colonizing Mars, therefore, is more important because even if in the process the Earth gets totally ruined because we didn't do anything about the climate, even if of the 8 billion people, more than 7 billion die, even if only a million or a few thousand people survived on the Earth, in the grand scheme of things, that would be nothing. That would be a minor setback. But as long as we just get a few people to Mars and they colonize it and multiply and then colonize further planets, then we will have quadrillions of people in the future that can all be happy. Again, here you clearly see there's never an end, because let's say we have colonized the whole galaxy, these people are also worthless. And whatever problems they may have, maybe they are ruining the galaxy and ruining its resources and whatever, or fighting wars, also don't need to be solved. Rather, we should focus on colonizing other galaxies now. Why should there just be quadrillions when there could be fantastillions of people? Why should we just colonize one galaxy when we should colonize the whole universe? And this shows that this utilitarian ideology, if you sink it to its logical conclusion, which is this long-termism, is totalitarian. In fact, if you read what Hannah Arendt wrote on the origins and elements of totalitarianism, it fits this long-termism ideology so perfectly that maybe looking back one day, we will say Hitler and Stalin, the two people and their ideologies that Arendt analyzes, were just amateurs. This was just the first very limited, very imperfect try on totalitarianism. This long-termism ideology exemplifies totalitarianism in a much more perfect, much more pure way. Arendt is saying that totalitarianism arises when you sink an ideology, which could be any ideology, to its logical conclusion. Be it communism, be it racism, but in this case it could also be this utilitarian ideology. And Arendt describes that totalitarianism is always about the future. It is never about the now, also not about the tomorrow, because tomorrow it will again be about the next tomorrow. It is about a future that you never reach. And it is always ready to sacrifice the now and to sacrifice any number of people for the future. The Bolsheviks didn't fight for the working class against other classes. No, they fought for some future classless society. And therefore they were ready to sacrifice anyone, including the workers, for that future. The Nazis didn't fight for the German nation against other nations or races. They fought for some master race, which wasn't there yet. They didn't think the Germans were the master race, but rather the master race should be bred out of the best elements of the Germans, out of the SS. For over 1,000 years, the master race should be created. And therefore, any number of people, of lesser, of subhuman people, including the lesser Germans that were too weak or that had disabilities or illnesses or whatever, could be sacrificed. Well, that's exactly what this long-termism says. You can even sacrifice the whole Earth, the whole planet, in order to one day colonize the whole galaxy or whatever. This is where utilitarianism, this is where an ideology that says humanity as such has no value, is not a purpose in itself, but rather can be sacrificed for others, for more, this is where it leads to, if you sink it to its logical conclusion. So therefore, it is important that you must treat humanity as an end, as a purpose in itself, which in the case of the trolley problem means, of course, not becoming a murderer, because those 5 people would have died even if you had never come across them, even if you had never seen the trolley driving towards them. It is unfortunate that you cannot save them, but you are not their murderer. It was just destiny, so to say. They couldn't be saved without committing a crime. But if you pull the lever, thereby killing an innocent person who would not have died if you hadn't come along, you become a murderer. Doesn't matter your good intentions, doesn't matter if you saved 5 or even 5,000 people, you are still a murderer. What is interesting here is that there is another thought experiment which is the exact same to the trolley problem, and yet still people answer to it differently. In the second thought experiment, you are a physician at a hospital and you have 5 patients that are all dying and are all missing some organ. Like one of them needs a new lung, the other needs a new heart, the next one needs new kidney or whatever. And now a 6th person enters who is perfectly healthy and who has all the organs that the other 5 need, who's just there for, I don't know, a routine checkup or something. And now the question is, would you murder that 6th person to take his organs and give to the other 5? And interestingly enough, there have been polls, there have been questions when people are presented with the trolley problem. A majority of people says, I would pull the lever. I would make the trolley run over the 1 person and save the 5 people. But when presented with this other scenario, less people give that answer. A majority says, no, I would not kill that 1 healthy person to use his organs for the 5 others. And I'm sorry, but this makes no sense. If you answer one way in that one scenario and the other way in that other scenario, you cannot be taken seriously as a rational being anymore. Because reason, and I discussed that in another lecture on what is reason. Reason, according to Kant, is the faculty of principles. Being rational means you have a principle, a basic ground principle, and from that you deduce the individual cases. And therefore, being rational means being consistent, always acting and judging in one and the same manner, not contradicting yourself. Either it is fine to sacrifice 1 innocent person for saving 5 lives that would otherwise die, or it is not fine. But it cannot be fine in one case and not fine in the other. That makes no sense. And of course it can be explained easily why people judge in 2 different manners here, and the explanation is that they are unaufkläred. Aufklärung means thinking for yourself, guiding, leading yourself. Being unaufkläred means following, being guided, being led. And many people tend to misunderstand that. I will get more into that in a future lecture on Kant's concept of Aufklärung. Many people think it is just about whether you follow other people. And they then think, oh, I'm aufkläred because I don't do what I'm told. I don't blindly trust some priest, or I don't blindly trust the media or whatever. Therefore, I'm an aufkläred person. While that is part of it, another part, a bigger part even, a more important part, is not just not being led by other people, but not being led by your own sensuality. If you are a slave to how you are affected, to, so to say, what happens to fall into your eyes or into your ears or whatever, you are still an unaufkläred person. And that's what's happening here, right? Those 2 scenarios, essentially, they are different. They feel different. In the one case, I'm just pulling a lever. I'm not really getting my own hands dirty. Also, everything happens much faster. And in another case, it's a slower process. The people without the organs are dying slowly. And most importantly, probably, I'm getting blood onto my own hands. I'm murdering that 1 healthy guy with my own hands, and even cutting open his body and pulling out the organs and so on. And that is what makes it more obvious to people that this is murder, that this is evil. And this is a big problem. That people are so unaufkläred, so led by their senses. I mean, even someone like Eichmann, who organized the whole Holocaust, who was responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust. Arendt describes this. Eichmann said that he was a very sensitive guy. He couldn't ever have been a physician because he couldn't see blood. And the one time he actually witnessed the murder of Jews. The one time he was actually at the front, and dozens of people were pushed into a big hole dug in the ground, and then with machine guns they would just fire into that hole with women and children in it. He couldn't see that. He was disgusted by it. He was shocked. But all the other times, when he was just sitting at his desk, filling out forms, knowing in an abstract manner, knowing full well what these forms were about, knowing full well those Jews that he put on trains where they were taken to, that was perfectly fine to him, just because he didn't see the blood. Well, the aufkläred person can abstract from his senses, and the aufkläred person can think in principles. This is what science is about, as Fichte says. Fichte would say that the scientist doesn't just observe facts as they are in the world, but he thinks genetically, by which Fichte means the scientist understands a law and he sees the genesis, the coming into being of the specific fact from that law. He knows, for example, the law of gravitation, and so he can deduce a priori that an apple, when it gets loose on the tree, will fall down. He doesn't need to first see the apple falling down. He knows beforehand that it will fall down. And here too, when it comes to a science like physics, someone who is just a slave to his senses may struggle with it. Like, there's this famous statement by Archimedes, who said, give me a steady point to stand on and I can move the whole world from it. Someone who is so enthralled by his senses may say, oh, come on, that's arrogant, that's an overstatement, how could you move the whole world? Maybe if you have a lever, maybe if you have tools, you can move a heavy object, maybe you can move some rock, but the world is way too huge. But to the physicist who knows the laws of physics, the laws of mechanics, there is no difference between a rock and the whole earth. It's a difference of scale, it's a difference of quantity, but the inequality, the laws of nature that apply here are not different. And likewise, in this moral question, the trolley problem and this other example where you are a physician, if you abstract from the sensual appearance of the problem and just consider it in itself, it is exactly the same scenario. In both scenarios, you have 5 people that are about to die, not because of you, but because of, so to say, destiny. It just so happens that they are in mortal danger, and they would die anyways if you weren't there. And of course, you should, if you could, try to save their lives, but in both instances, you can only save their life by murdering a 6th person who otherwise would have lived. It's one and the same scenario. You have to judge them both in one and the same way. And if people don't become more aufkläred, in such moral matters. There is no future for humanity, especially now in the age of the climate emergency, because this is an instance where our senses don't immediately show us the consequences of our actions. I mean, most people wouldn't break a dam and watch a whole valley with hundreds or thousands of people being flooded. Most people wouldn't burn down a forest and watch the nearby town go up in flames. But the same people who wouldn't do that are perfectly fine getting onto a plane, getting into a car, consuming endlessly things that they don't need, even if they have the abstract knowledge that it will lead to great fires like we saw in LA or in Canada or in Turkey or in Australia in the past years, or that it will lead to great floods like one we had here in Germany where like 150 people or so died some years ago. But since they are so unaufkläred, since they are so bound to their senses, that knowledge is not enough for them. As long as they don't see, as long as they don't get their own hands dirty, they don't feel like they are doing anything wrong. And that is why Aufklärung is so important, why it is so important to rise above sensuality and to get this scientific, this rational way of thinking in principles and laws. And speaking of laws, this moral philosophy of Kant has influenced laws too, especially here in Germany, the country of Kant, right? Our constitution starts off with saying human dignity is inviolable. All other laws must be subjected to that, must respect human dignity. And there's not many good things you can say about Germany and about German politics. There really isn't. But this is one good thing you can say about post-World War II Germany. Because indeed there have been instances where they tried again and again. Because politicians or also a big part of the populace, of the voters, would certainly like to treat people as mere means. There have been cases where policemen wanted to torture a suspect who might have kidnapped someone in order to find that kidnapped person in time and save that kidnapped person's lives. But that is unconstitutional. Or there has been the instance of a former minister of the interior after 9/11 trying to pass a law that would have allowed the military to shoot down a hijacked plane, even with hostages on it, before it can be flown into some building or something. But the Supreme Court said that this is unconstitutional. You cannot just sacrifice the hostages on the plane in order to potentially save other lives. And the fact that this is so in Germany is clearly due to the lasting influence of Kant, because in certain other states, like the Anglo-Saxon states, are more influenced by utilitarianism, and there it is much more possible, even within the constitution, even with the blessing of the Supreme Court, to pull off a thing like that and sacrifice some people for some alleged greater good. But also, we don't have to just look at national law. We can also look at international law, where, amongst other crimes, we have the crime against humanity, right? And while this might not be so directly influenced by Kant, or at least not by Kant alone, still, using Kant's philosophy and using the second version of the categorical imperative, we can better understand what that actually is. What is a crime against humanity? Kant would say, well, a crime against humanity is not just a crime against a specific human, right? If I kill or if I torture or if I rape one specific individual, of course that is evil. But it is an evil committed against this specific individual, not against anyone. But if a state or some military or paramilitary actor or whoever commits acts that are considered crimes against humanity, what we are saying is basically that the victims of those acts are not just the individual victims that are being killed or tortured or whatever, but rather the victim is humanity as such. Because here human rights as such come into question. Here, what the perpetrators are basically saying is humans have no dignity, humans have no value. This can be done to anyone. And this is why this is so important. This is why everyone should care about that. Like, even if you are immoral, even from a mere perspective of prudence, from a merely pragmatic perspective, you should care about crimes against humanity. You cannot just say, I don't care about, I don't know, what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza. I'm here, safe and sound, far away. What do I care? I mean, apart from that making you scum, it also makes you stupid. Kant has one favorite quote. I mean, he has a number of favorite quotes. He really liked the classics, the classic Latin and Stoic authors. He grew up with them, reading them in school, having to memorize some of them, and even in old age he still had lines of theirs memorized, and he would like to quote them at times. And one of his favorite quotes, going back to the author Terence, is "Homo sum nihil humani a me alienum esse puto," which Kant likes to translate as "I am a human being. Whatever happens to human beings happens to me, or also befalls me." The point is, if this is possible, if it is possible for humanity being disregarded so much, then my humanity is also being disregarded. Like, look what Moscovia is doing. If it is possible to, as they did in Ukraine, to attack another state, to annex land, territory from that state, and to murder, to have torture chambers, to rape in the hundreds and thousands, and to abduct people. I mean, Moscovia has abducted about 4 million Ukrainians. And those are the numbers they themselves give. You cannot even say, oh, this is just Western propaganda. No, this is what they themselves say. They have abducted 4 million Ukrainians. Women they want to use for breeding. Children they want to indoctrinate and raise as their own. 4 million. That's 1/10 of the population of Ukraine. If that can befall Ukrainians, it can befall anyone. If Moscovia isn't stopped from doing that to Ukraine, they can tomorrow attack, I don't know, Finland or Iceland or Poland and do it to them. Or not even Moscovia. If they can do it, some other state somewhere else can do it, then China can attack Taiwan, or the USA under Trump can attack Canada or Greenland and do the same there. Or likewise, if you look at Gaza, even if you are so evil that you say, I don't care morally, you should at least not be so stupid not to care. Because, and I really, especially here in Germany, where, of course, there's a fanatical pro-Zionist ideology, I really wonder sometimes, are you people not afraid? Are you not afraid at all of the consequences? What Israel is doing, destroying everything, bombing indiscriminately, destroying schools, destroying hospitals, destroying mosques, destroying graveyards, destroying churches, because of course, yeah, there are also churches, there are Christians there, the Palestinians are not all Mohammedans. Destroying everything. And just saying as a justification, the people are used as human shields. Then anyone can do that. What if tomorrow there's a war here? And it's becoming more and more of a possibility, even for Western countries who have known peace for decades now. And with the rising climate emergency, with droughts and food shortages coming, it's becoming more and more of a possibility that there will be wars, that there will be large wars. And if international law has been broken down, if it has become common that you can just bomb the hospital and say, there were combatants in there, it was used by Hamas or by whoever, and therefore it was okay to sacrifice all the civilians that were still in there, then we are not safe either. If you can just, as Israel does now, if you can just block all humanitarian aid, if you can just block all food, if you can starve a whole population of 2 million in order to put political pressure on some militants or in order to get like 50 hostages back. And to be clear, because you're always asked, do you condemn and so on and so on. Of course, hostage taking is wrong. Of course, that's also a war crime. But the point is, if in order to get a few hostages back, you can starve 2 million people, then in the next war, in some other place, some other city, the people can be starved. If it becomes justified to use terror attacks as a state, and that's what Israel did in Lebanon against Hezbollah, right? That's this pager attack. Clearly, that was a terror attack. There is no way to define it as anything else. Terror is not defined by whether it's done by a state or by non-state actors. This was a terror attack. They just randomly exploded those pagers, killing not just combatants. I mean, even those can only be killed when they actually are in combat, according to international law. They cannot be killed when they are just going about their day in their private lives. Like a soldier, just because that is his profession, just because he's a soldier, is not a target 24/7 when he is not currently serving. But not even just them were killed, but also the people standing around them. They were shopping groceries, they were next to their kids. It was a terror attack. If that becomes normal, it can happen to anyone. Any regime can now put explosives in people's, I don't know, we don't all have pagers, but in people's smartphones maybe, and explode them. And not just against enemies in another state, not just in wars. Used to say that it will not become common practice for tyrannies to use that against their political enemies, to use that against their opposition. to use that against people who criticize them. Maybe even people who fled the state, who are on the other side of the earth. They could maybe still explode their smartphone. If these things become common practice, or Israel attacking Syria, which, I mean, if anything else, if nothing they did in Gaza was a red line, at least that should have been a red line for its Western allies. I mean, there is no possible justification there. You cannot claim here that, even on the most flimsy excuses, that Israel is defending itself or that Israel is just wanting to get back the hostages. There are no hostages in Syria. There's also no self-defense. Syria didn't attack Israel in any matter. No, they're just saying we do it because we can. Our neighbor is currently weak. They just had a civil war for 13 years. They just had a revolution. They are weak still. We are using this opportunity to attack and to get a buffer zone for our illegally annexed buffer zone. If this becomes common practice, it can happen to anyone. If Israel can do this to Syria, to Lebanon, to Gaza, anyone can do it to anyone. And that is the point with crimes against humanity. They really are crimes not just against the specific victims, but against all of us. Because through committing those crimes, the perpetrator is basically saying humanity is worth nothing. If this can hit one human being, if one human being can be devalued so much, it can hit anyone. I mean, going back to totalitarianism, that was the whole horror of it, which is what many people don't understand. Like, when people think about the Nazis, they think, okay, sure, they killed the Jews and also others, like the Gypsies, or maybe they wanted to kill the Slavs in Poland and Ukraine, sure. But at least they were pro-German. No, they were not pro-German. They were anti-humanity. And they were willing to sacrifice any number of Germans. And they also killed Germans, of course, that were the wrong type of Germans. And not just that had the wrong opinions, not just their political enemies, not just communists or so. No, they killed homosexuals. They killed disabled people. And they prepared to kill millions more. There was already a health bill prepared by Hitler to be in place after he would have won the war, requiring every single German to get a medical checkup. And if someone was found to have heart problems or lung problems, he and his whole family, even the ones of his family that are healthy, because they might still have this genetic condition, they might still pass it on to their children, they would all have been exterminated. So that is why back then, as a German, even if you would have said, oh, I don't care what happens to the Jews, I don't care if they all died, I mean, that would have been evil, sure, but it would also have been stupid, because if this can be done to the Jews, or to the Gypsies, or to the homosexuals, or to the Poles, or whatever, then it can be done to anyone. That is what a crime against humanity means, and that is why, even from a pragmatic, egoistical standpoint, let alone, of course, from a moral standpoint, we should all care about that. We should all care about that a great deal. But there is one more thing I want to address. I already said in the previous lecture, on the first version of the categorical imperative, that according to Kant, when you treat somebody according to his own maxim, and therefore do against the criminal what he has done against others. If you murder the murderer, if you lie to the liar, if you steal from the thief, you are not committing an injustice against that person. But I said in that lecture that according to Kant, you're still not morally allowed to do that. It's still evil, but you're not committing an injustice against that person. You're committing an injustice against humanity. And maybe now you can better understand what is meant by that. The homo phenomenon, so the empirical individual that appears in the sensual world, might be an evil person. And in that case, you might not be unjust against him as this individual if you treat him the way he treats others. But within himself, so to speak, there's still the homo noumenon. He still has this humanity. He still has this autonomy which you ought to have reverence for. Even if he, the way he appears, might be a scumbag. And that is a very important insight of Kant's. I find it important, for example, when something like capital punishment is discussed. Because usually those who are against it, they often have very weak arguments. They try to appeal to our humane feelings, our feelings of sympathy, our compassion. And then others who are for capital punishment will respond, look, these people there who have murdered lots of people or who have raped children or whatever, I don't feel any compassion for them. The world would be better off without them. They deserve to suffer. They deserve to die. And in this instance, we can apply Kant's sympathetic method. Again, I have a lecture on that method where I go into more detail. That tells us that there is no complete, there's only partial error, and we should, if there's two opposing sides, we should try to form them into a third, into a middle position. And in this case, I would say that the latter side, so those who support capital punishment, who say, oh, those people are scum, we can't have compassion with them, they deserve to die, they are right, except in their conclusion that therefore there should be capital punishment. While the other side, if they argue with compassion, if they argue with sympathy, they are wrong in that, but still they are right that there should not be capital punishment. Because, let's face it, there are some people who are scum. There are some people where we must judge the world would be better off without them. As sensual individuals. But still, even those people have a humanity. Even those people have autonomy. That means they have at least the potential to be better, to understand that what they did was wrong, to feel guilty, to feel regret, to get redemption. I'm not saying that this will happen. I'm not saying that this is even likely to happen. But even if it had never happened in a single instance, you still have to agree that potentially it could happen. If they have free will, it means they are able to reform. Whether they will do it or not, but they are able to. And we are not God. We cannot look into their hearts. So it is not on us to judge whether somebody is truly and utterly lost and beyond redemption, or whether somebody will maybe one day feel guilty and turn back. And it is important even to believe that, especially if you want to judge that person, because otherwise you are contradicting yourself. If you really say, this person here is so evil, he is beyond redemption, he has no free will, he cannot ever become good, I am 100% sure he will forever stay evil, and only if you could say that would you be justified in actually killing such a person, because then that would mean that his humanity was completely gone. But if you say that, you can no longer be angry against that person. You can no longer hate that person. Because if you say that person cannot possibly, no matter how unlikely, but not possibly at all, become good, you're saying that person has no free will, then you're saying that person has no responsibility. Then you're saying whatever he did was not his fault. Then he's just a product of nature. Then, sure, he might cause terrible harm, but so does an earthquake or a tsunami, and still we don't call them evil. We don't morally judge them. We don't say it's their fault. We understand that they are just forces of nature. And in that case, you may kill this guy just to prevent further harm. Like you may kill a rabid dog before he bites more people. But you cannot call this a punishment anymore. You cannot say that this is a matter of justice. You can just say that this is a matter of prudence and of preventing further harm. Because he's like a wild beast. So really, people who say that someone may have deserved death are self-contradicting. Because if he is someone who can deserve anything, that is, if he is someone who is free and therefore responsible for his actions, then he also has the freedom to turn back and to, so to say, undeserve death. It would maybe be better, instead of speaking of human dignity, to speak of humanity's dignity, because it is not the sensual human that has dignity. If you think about it, that sensual human, sure, it's easy to say, oh, this specific human, he did evil, he harmed people, he's a bad person, we should get rid of him. But even if someone didn't harm anyone, or even if someone caused good things, if you consider it in the grand scheme of things, not from, well, our limited human perspective, but from a cosmic, universal perspective, none of that matters. As sensual beings, we are all worthless. We are all pathetic. As sensual beings, humans are not worth any more than lies. And I already quoted that in another lecture. Kant at some point says about lies that they are insects, that both in their manner of living and also in their general worthlessness very well reflect the state of most human beings. So Kant by no means had a good opinion of humans as they are. No, humans as such, I mean, we live for what, 80, 90 years? That's not even the blink of an eye, considered from the perspective of the universe. We walk around here on this little speck of dust floating through the vast space. Nothing that we are, this accident of evolution that we are, nothing of this has any value. If I look from the sensual side, if I consider us as animals, as parts of nature, why would we have more value, more importance to the universe than the ants walking around here? So, from that perspective, not just the murderer or the rapist or whoever is worthless, but we are all worthless. And this is important. I mean, this is what the materialists are saying nowadays, at least the more consistent ones of them, right? They are saying that, as Bentham said, human rights are nonsense up on stilts. There is no such thing as value. There is no such thing as a value in itself, as dignity. Nothing matters. It's a cold and uncaring universe, and they are entirely right, as long as we are assuming the perspective of nature. They are only wrong in that they are not transcendental idealists, that they don't realize that this nature isn't everything there is, it isn't a thing in itself, it is just an appearance. So they are only wrong in being a-rationalists, not believing in reason. If you follow Kant, if you believe that reason is actually a thing, then you can say that, of course, as a sensual being, I'm pathetic, I'm powerless. Let the earth drift a little closer to the sun and we are all gone. Let the sun, with all its might, it could so easily swallow the earth, let the sun get close to a black hole and it is gone. But, from another perspective, even the sun or even a black hole, mighty as they are, powerless as we would be against them, even they are nothing against us. Because even they are just objects, are just items. Even they are heteronomous. Even they are subjected to the laws of nature. They don't have their own purposes. They can set their own purposes for themselves. So, while essentially we are so much inferior to them, rationally, by the token of us having autonomy, of us having free will, of us being able to set a purpose for ourselves, we are much greater, much more amazing, much more dignified, much more sublime than even this black hole. And by the way, if you go back to my lecture on the sublime, that is exactly how Kant describes this feeling of the sublime. That is what this aesthetical feeling is based on. Feeling how essential beings in the face of a storm or at the edge of a mighty cliff or whatever, we are inferior, but that precisely waking up our rational side, so to say, reminding us that we are more than these sensual animals that are inferior and pathetic. So it is not the sensual human that you are asked to have reverence for. In that case, the problem would not just the human who has done a crime and therefore cannot be respected anymore. The problem would be anyone, because no one can be respected if you look from the perspective of the cosmos. But what you should have reverence for is the humanity as such, is the autonomy as such, is the not the homo phenomenon, but the homo noumenon, the rational being. So, in this, as in other things, Kant's morality aligns with the biblical morality. The man of the flesh cannot enter the kingdom of God. The man of the flesh is sinful, is pathetic, is worthless, is condemned. You have to die in the flesh and be reborn in spirit to enter the kingdom of heaven, to say it in biblical terms. I mean, the Bible says that man was created in God's image. Going with Fichte, it is not man, it is humanity that was created in God's image. And Fichte, of course, is not the first to point that out. I mean, you also have certain mystics that make this distinction, like in the Kabbalah, you have Adam Kadmon, the original human. Adam just meaning human, right? Not being the name of a specific person, but being humanity as such, that was created first, and out of which all the individuals with their individual souls then come. The individual person cannot be the image of God. I mean, what would that mean? God is not sensual. God is not so and so tall, or has this or that eye color or skin color or so on. No, it is humanity that is rationality, autonomy, free will, morality, which is the image of God. So Fichte would say the individual human is not the image of God, he is just the image of God, a copy of a copy, so to say. And only he who fully realizes his humanity For Fichte, that was Jesus, but whatever you believe, only he who fully realizes his humanity is the true image, the true Son of God. And that is what morality should be about. And that is what having reverence for others should be about. Revering this image of godness, revering this homo noumenon, revering not what they are, but what they could be. It's like as if you have an egg. The egg is just a shell. It's worthless. You could just throw it away mindlessly, breaking it in the process if it was just that shell. But there's a little bird inside. And you might be careful with the egg. You might warm the egg so that the bird hatches. Not because you respect the egg as such, but because you respect the bird that is inside, that could come out. And maybe with a lot of people the bird will never come out. Maybe with a lot of people the eggshell is very, very sick and might never break. But as long as you're not 100% sure that there's no bird inside, you also have no justification and no right to just smash the egg. And I know that in some cases it can be very, very difficult to find that, so to say, divine spark in a human being. Like I always try, no matter how evil someone is on the outside, no matter how much I'm disgusted by that person and his actions, I always try to find the inner humanity, no matter how much it is buried. It's not always easy, and at least in one case I couldn't manage. There's one person where I only saw evil and complete disregard for humanity. And when I try to look deeper to find some small good in that person, the deeper I looked, the more emptiness and nastiness I found. But I would never blame that person for that. If anything, I would blame myself. It is a fault of my own, not having found the humanity, the divine spark in that person. I would not hold that against that other person. And I would therefore not kill that other person just like that. Just because I couldn't see it. Because, again, I'm not God. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean God can't see it. Doesn't mean it's not there. So, Kant's morality is not about, as common humanistic compassion ethics are, it's not about the outer human. It's not about compassion with the homo phenomenon, because Kant would agree here that sometimes the homo phenomenon is such that we cannot have compassion with him, but rather it is about reverence for the inner homo noumenon. And that is something that, especially today, many people could learn from, because the whole humanistic morality, the whole morality of the left is just focused on this outer human being, and on sort of denying his patheticness. And this becomes a big problem. This can go so far as becoming immoral, because this is what can lead to forcing others to be happy. And right, I already talked about how that too is evil, because that too disregards their autonomy. If, like some Lassalle, you think you are meant to be the leader of the unaufkläred masses of workers, if, like the communists, you try to erect a state that forces people to their own good, to their own happiness, if, like Proudhon, you say the crazy people in the asylum are not asked by the psychiatrist if they want to take a bath, they are just forced to take a bath. That too is disregard, no matter how well-meaning it is. And nowadays the left has reached a stage with the woke slave morality where they demand so much respect for people's sensitivities. So, again, for the homo phenomenon, for the sensual person, not being hurt even in the slightest ways, like they will talk about things like microaggressions, and they demand safe spaces, which is a rejection of life. That is not how life works. In life, there are no safe spaces. Life is ever moving and ever challenging you. You cannot just say, oh, life, it's too cold today. I need a safe space where it's warmer. You can, of course, respond to the cold. You don't have to just freeze. You can respond to it being cold today by dressing warmer or something. But you cannot just blame life for the cold weather. But they demand every little sensitivity being respected. Every whim someone might have, every personal neurosis somebody might have, needs to be respected. They have glorified people going completely nuts, becoming hysteric over the slightest imagined offenses. And that is not regard for humanity. Again, let's go back to the analogy of the bird. If you are so focused on the eggshell, respecting the eggshell, preventing the slightest hurt to the eggshell, then whenever there's a crack in the eggshell, you will try to patch it up, you will try to glue it together. By respecting the egg so much, you are suffocating the bird inside. If you really have regard for the bird inside, then of course you will not just immediately smash the egg before the bird has hatched. Of course you will be careful or mindful with the eggshell, not completely ignore it. But you will realize that the egg is not what truly matters. And you will realize that there might come a moment when it is even important for the bird and is even an act of regard for the bird to help the bird break free, to help break the eggshell, no matter how much the shell might complain about it. I mean, if we think this ideology to its logical conclusions, this constantly being mindful of people's sensitivities, never hurting them at all, then we would have to give drug addicts the drugs they want. If you take away their drugs, they will suffer for a time. Maybe eventually they will get better, they will be cured of their addiction, but at first they will suffer. So if the morality just says we must prevent all suffering, that is not an act of regard for humanity. Quite the opposite. That is disregard of humanity. That is disregard of freedom. If we are really free beings, we are not just victims that need to be shielded from everything that could ever possibly touch them, but rather we are perpetrators. We can govern ourselves and we can decide how we deal with life and how it touches us. And this, I might add, is what Nietzsche's critique of morality is about, right? Nietzsche is not so much critiquing actual morality, even if lots of people think that. What Nietzsche is critiquing, this what he calls slave morality, is exactly what I'm describing here. I mean, Nietzsche is not speaking in Kantian terminology. Nietzsche is not talking about the homo phenomenon and the homo noumenon. But the motto of Nietzsche's philosophy, become who you are, could in Kantian terms be expressed as become the homo noumenon. Stop just being this homo phenomenon and become your true rational self. And when Nietzsche criticizes about this slave morality of the humanists, of today's left or whatever, is precisely that they suffocate the birth for the sake of the actual, that they want to prevent suffering so much that what they are actually preventing is humanity, is human greatness, is human realization and Aufklärung. Because Aufklärung is ultimately, as I always emphasize, about self-reflection and self-criticism. And seeing yourself for what you are, seeing your faults, might hurt at first. If nothing else, it might hurt your own narcissism. It is of course necessary, however, if you are ever to work on yourself, if you are ever to grow up and become more than you are, if you are ever to realize your potential. But with this morality of many of the leftists, and I've often experienced that firsthand, it is often the Aufklärer, despite his great regard for humanity, who is treated as the most evil person simply because he tells others to criticize themselves. If I tell somebody else to have some self-reflection, if I try to help him with that self-reflection, if I point out certain things about himself, how he acts, how he's not just a victim but a perpetrator, how what happens to him, or how he feels about it at least, is his choice and his making, then many treat that as an attack. Many treat me for that as if I was the evil person and not the person helping that human being to turn from something pathetic into something truly rational and aufkläred and with true dignity. And since I'm already criticizing this left, there's one more to add here, one more thing. Because nowadays, of course, Kant gets attacked a lot for, well, not having been political correct. And there are some people that want to cancel Kant, like there's a lot of talk about how Kant was racist and so on. And I will address that in its own lecture at some point when I get to what Kant says about natural science. There I will get to what he said about race and whether he was racist. But in brief, sure, Kant did believe in human races, and he did believe that race doesn't just affect skin color, but also the temperament and even the intellect of people. And yes, in that way he had theoretical racism. That is, he had opinions about the different abilities of different races and about the white race being most talented, most smart, that were racist, to be sure, and we shouldn't gloss over that. But we should also realize that it is precisely Kant who laid the grounds for true moral universalism, and that if we reject Kant, we are rejecting, and if we reject his morality, we are rejecting his universalism. We are rejecting a morality that allows us to have reverence, to have regard for humanity as such, despite all the outer differences. Because Kant might have been a theoretical racist, but he was not a practical racist. He never said he was against colonialism, he was against slavery. He never said that those differences between people that he believed in justify enslaving some of them, treating some of them as cattle. Because the very universalist values that allow us to criticize racism, and on whose basis people now criticize Kant or want to cancel Kant, those very universalist values are not possible if we reject Kant. And here there's a great issue. The age of Aufklärung came up with the idea of equality, that everyone should be equal in rights, in dignity, that everyone should be treated equally in a moral sense. that idea has been taken up by most people. Not just the aufkläred people. But most people didn't aufklär themselves, and therefore they took up this idea in the most superficial manner. They understood it as referring to an outer equality, referring to an equality of the homo phenomenon. Meaning, we have to treat people equally because they actually are equal as sensual individuals. And that is, of course, not true. And that can only lead, if you have started thinking in that way, if you understand equality in this sensual manner, that can only lead in two directions. One is the direction that the fascists have taken. Because fascism is not about inequality, right? It is not about, like in older times, in the Middle Ages or so, people weren't fascists back then. They believed in inequality. They believed, okay, there are nobles, there are peasants, not everyone is the same. But that was not fascist. No, fascism is, in this sense, a bastard child of Aufklärung. It is a misunderstanding of this ideal of equality of Aufklärung. Fascism is egalitarian in the sense that they say everyone should be the same. The problem is just that they realize, okay, sensually speaking, everyone isn't the same, therefore we need to make them the same. The Nazis called it Gleichschaltung, coordination or equalization. And whoever cannot be gleichgeschaltet, whoever cannot be coordinated, needs to be killed off. In the end, there will only be blue-eyed and blonde people left if we killed all the others. Or if we kill all the infidels, then only the true believers will be left. It doesn't matter what type of fascist you are, what type of ideology you have. The moment you say everyone should be the same, you can easily say, okay, everyone who isn't the same and cannot be made the same, who will not convert or whatever, will just be killed off. The other way would be exactly the way that these leftists have taken, which is also, like the fascists, starting from the wrong premise that you can only treat people as equals if they actually are equal in the outer sense, as sensual beings. And therefore those leftists need to just deny the inequalities between people. They need to just get angry and scream of racism or sexism or whatever whenever someone talks about people as sensual beings, as biological beings being not the same. Like Kant does in his considerations of race. And sure, to be sure, what Kant says about the inequalities between people happens to be wrong. But there really are inequalities. Not the ones he named, not ones that go along racial lines, but of course there are inequalities. Some people are taller than others. Some people are stronger than others. Some people are faster than others. Some people are also smarter than others, to be sure. It is a little superficial and a little primitive to just say that these inequalities run along racial lines or along sexual lines, but they are there nonetheless. And there's no point just denying that. No. What Kant would say is that we don't need this outer equality. I mean, you're not a moral person if you manage to treat someone the same as you treat yourself, who actually is the same as yourself. That's not a big accomplishment. And again, even the fascist does that. No. You are moral if you manage to treat people who are different from you still with the same worth, as having the same human dignity, because despite all the difference, you understand that as humans, as such, they are still the same. It doesn't matter if you are taller or have a higher status or make more money or are smarter or more educated or whatever than somebody else. That somebody else is still just as much a human being as you are. Because Kant bases morality only on autonomy. We are a purpose in ourselves, not because we are particularly smart or whatever, but because we have free will and we can set purposes for ourselves. I mean, what do we know? How smart we really are, how great we really are compared to other rational beings. Maybe there are some alien races, or there are some higher beings, like some, from our perspective, godlike beings, some higher spirits, some angels, some eons, and whatever, some seraphs, who are much superior to us when it comes to the capacities of their intellect. Maybe the difference between them and us is much bigger than the difference the racist imagines between whites and blacks or whatever. Maybe when it comes to instrumental reason, so using reason to understand the world, to understand the laws of nature, and then applying it to use that nature for us, they are superior to us to a level we cannot even comprehend. So, if morality, as both the fascists and these leftists tend to do, was based on the way we appear in the sensual world, if we only, had to treat people equally, that on the outside are equal to us, have the same abilities and so on, then those higher beings could have any right to scratch us like bugs or to enslave us or whatever. I mean, that is the argument in the Quran that the devil, Iblis, puts forward, right? When God creates Adam, creates the human being from the earth, Iblis, being a jinn, says, well, I'm made of fire. I'm better than him. I'm superior. I will not bow down to him. I will consider him a lesser being. In the Quran, the devil is not first rebelling against God as such. He is rebelling against God, demanding that he pay reverence to the human being, which he considers inferior. But with Kant, we could reply to this devil, maybe you are so much superior. Maybe we are made from mud and you are made from fire. Maybe you have far greater insight into all the secrets of the universe. Maybe you are far more powerful than us. But we are equally free, equally autonomous as you. Because freedom is not a matter of degree, right? Either you have free will or you don't. You cannot be a little free or more free. Either you are or you aren't. We can set ourselves a purpose. The dumbest person you can imagine can still set himself a purpose, can still say, I want this, I don't want this. And that is something you ought to have reverence for. I mean, otherwise, we would not have to give human rights to children, right? I mean, nowadays we might no longer say that black people's minds are inferior or that women's minds are inferior, but we still say that children's minds are inferior. But that doesn't say that they have less right to live, that they have less right to live with dignity, that they have less right to be free. And that is the greatness of Kant's moral principle. that it doesn't depend on how smart somebody is or whatever. It depends only on that inner autonomy, on that inner freedom, on that ability to tell right from wrong. That is what we ought to respect. And therefore, that is precisely the reason why Kant could say, even if he considered black people to have a lesser intellect than white people, which surely was wrong on a theoretical level, but this theoretical error did not lead to a practical error. The great revolution that Kant does in philosophy is about putting the practical above the theoretical. It's no longer like people believed for the longest time since Plato that the theory comes first, understanding the world comes first, and from the theory follows how we should act. No, the acting comes first. Our moral duty comes first. And if anything, as Fichte would then go on to show, from that comes what we think, what we understand of the world. So Kant would say, I ought to treat people as having equal rights, not because on the outside they are equal in their abilities or whatever, but because they are equally human, they are equally free, and that gives them equal dignity. That is what is so great about his moral principle. And he himself would try to teach that to his students. I mean, this whole issue of races was not so much an everyday issue for him, right? I mean, again, he did state at several points that he was against colonialism, but I mean, in day-to-day life, I doubt that Kant ever even met a black person. I mean, it was Königsberg in the 18th century. There were not that many non-white people walking around. But there were, however, of course, stark differences. I mean, it was a still somewhat feudal society. There were serfs who had no freedom, and Kant was very much against serfdom. And Kant would again and again in his lectures try to tell his students, those young men being raised to be physicians and jurists and priests, you are scholars. You are maybe more educated than others. You may be the intellectual elite or whatever. And we should consider here that back then going to university was much more special than it is nowadays. Like nowadays, like everyone seems to go, like half the people study at university, but back then it was really just a very small number, a very small elite who did that. I mean, most people were common, I don't know, merchants or craftsmen or mostly peasants. And Kant himself did use in younger years to have some intellectual arrogance towards those people. He admitted that. Only after reading Rousseau, who was very influential on Kant, did he develop this regard for humanity as such. But then in those later years, he would try to instill in the students, maybe you're the intellectual elite, maybe you know more than the uneducated people, not just the peasants, also lots of the nobles were also very uneducated. But that is no reason to feel superior. That is no reason to be arrogant and to disregard their humanity. Because, again, compared to them, relatively, you might know more. Compared to some other higher beings, to some angels, maybe you too know very little and still wouldn't want those angels to look down on you. Our worth as rational, as autonomous beings does not depend on how much we know. It does not depend on us being scholars or whatever, on us being intellectuals. It does depend on this freedom and then on how we use it, on whether we are good or whether we are evil. And that is a decision everyone can make. And everyone who can make this decision is equally a person and has an equal dignity that ought to be revered. that is Kant's moral philosophy. That is what the categorical imperative, specifically in this second formula, is saying. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lening, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufklären cause.